I once matched with a girl named Francesca on Tinder. She seemed pretty cool from the start. She had a sleeve of tattoos on her left arm, red highlights in her hair, and she mentioned in her profile that she loved working out. One of her pictures was taken on the rooftop of a building with an incredible view, so I asked her where it was. She told me it was an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. Apparently, it was a great place to explore at night, and she had a lot of experience sneaking in. She suggested we go there together for our first date of sorts, and I thought it sounded pretty cool, way more exciting than the usual dinner and drinks. I picked her up from her house, and we drove for about 20 minutes to get to the hospital. The drive gave us a chance to talk and get comfortable with each other. When we arrived, Francesca told me to park down a hidden street surrounded by tall bushes. It was a short walk from there to the hospital. We snuck past a barrier that separated the road from the parking lot, then jogged across the lot to a grassy area near the entrance. Francesca seemed to know this place like the back of her hand and led us to a broken window that led down to the basement. I have to admit, it was pretty creepy, but I was up for the adventure. We only had our phone flashlights, nothing too fancy, and I was glad I wore old jeans since I was expecting to rip them on something. Francesca led us up a staircase to the upper floors. I was starting to get really nervous. Being in such a massive, dark place with just one other person was giving me an uneasy feeling. But it wasn't until later that I realized just how scary the night would get. As we walked down the first floor corridor, Francesca was talking so loud I felt like we might get caught. I almost told her to quiet down when suddenly we heard a noise, like a door opening or closing. Francesca froze, and I asked in a whisper, "Is it normal for other people to be here?" She told me it happened occasionally, but that we probably shouldn't worry. Then there was a loud bang from somewhere closer. We both scrambled in the dark, trying to find our way. We rushed back to the stairs and started climbing. A few floors up, we felt safe enough to speak again. Francesca reassured me that the cops didn't usually bother coming in, but she said it could have been other explorers. The weird thing was, there was no sign of any other lights in the hall. Whoever or whatever was moving around down there wasn't using flashlights. Then we heard footsteps from the stairwell. Someone was coming up after us. We panicked and took off, running through the maze-like hallways. It felt like we were being chased, and I didn't know what would be worse, being caught by the police or by whoever was following. Francesca led me to a small outdoor space, like a lower rooftop area. We stopped to catch our breath, but the whole being followed situation was ruining the vibe. I looked at her, and even though she was the expert here, she seemed just as concerned as I was. After a few minutes, we started feeling a little more relaxed. Francesca guided me through a broken window into another part of the building. We had to walk along some narrow wooden planks, high up off the ground, and I won't lie, I was terrified of falling. But I didn't want to back out now, so I followed her across the precarious boards. We eventually reached the top of a pillar where we sat to catch our breath. We were sitting there, talking, when I heard a sound from below. It was footsteps. Someone was walking beneath us. We turned on our flashlights and looked down. To our horror, there was a man standing below us, looking up with a creepy smile. He was dressed in black jacket, sweatpants, and a black beanie. He smiled even wider and said in a deep, eerie voice, "Come on down." I immediately felt my heart race. I asked him if he was the police, but he ignored me and repeated, "Come on down." Francesca and I jumped up and started walking back across the narrow planks, now more worried about falling than before. As we crossed, the man hurried out of the room below us and started moving toward the stairs. We could hear him coming, and he was definitely trying to catch us. We had to move fast. We ran down the stairwell, hearing his footsteps pounding behind us. I felt like we were running for our lives. We finally made it back to the first floor and bolted for the basement. We crawled through the broken window, the whole time thinking he might grab us, but by the time I climbed out after Francesca, we were pretty sure we had lost him. We ran across the parking lot and jumped into my car, locking the doors and trying to catch our breath. That night was a complete nightmare. The fear of being chased, not knowing who that man was or what he wanted, it was all too much. But somehow, going through that experience together created an unexpected bond between Francesca and me. Afterward, we went to Wendy's to grab something to eat and calm down. We spent about an hour just talking, still processing everything. When I dropped her off, I knew we'd stay in touch. We did stay friends for a while, and even though we were romantically involved for a few months, we ended up just keeping things platonic. Neither of us ever went back to that hospital though. It was an experience neither of us would forget. 3 years ago, I contracted bacterial meningitis. I live in South Florida, and to my knowledge, there wasn't an outbreak going on at the time. I have no idea how or where I caught it, but it hit me hard. It started with symptoms like painful headaches, confusion, nausea, sleepiness, and a complete lack of appetite. Things escalated quickly when I began having hallucinations. That's when I realized how serious this was. One afternoon, while lying sick in bed alone, my husband was at work, I distinctly heard a child's voice calling, "Mom," from downstairs. We don't have any kids. I forced myself out of bed, dizzy and weak, and looked down the stairway. I even called out my husband's name, though I knew he wasn't home. No one answered. The headache I got just from standing was unbearable, so I dragged myself back to bed. A little while later, I heard another voice, this time saying, "Hello." Panicked, I grabbed my phone and called my husband. I told him I was hearing voices in the house and I thought I might be hallucinating. Hearing how scared I was, he left work early to take me to the hospital. While waiting for him to get home, I tried to change out of my pajamas. Halfway through, I rushed to the bathroom to throw up. As I was hunched over, mid-vomit, I heard another voice, this time outside the bathroom. I couldn't make out what it said or if it sounded like the same voice as before, but it pushed me over the edge. I felt like I was losing my mind. When we arrived at the hospital, the doctors quickly diagnosed me with bacterial meningitis. They explained that if untreated, it could have been fatal. The hallucinations, they said, were unusual but not unheard of. They started me on antibiotics right away. The doctor said I was lucky to have come in when I did. Waiting much longer could have led to lasting damage, or worse. My husband stayed with me for a few hours that evening, but eventually, he went home since he had work the next day. The nurse assured me to call if I needed anything, though I still felt like death warmed over. That night, I fell asleep quickly, but I had a terrifying dream. In the dream, my ex-husband was standing over my bed, looking down at me. He started saying horrible things about my current husband, going on about how much he hated him, and even saying he wanted to kill him. He reached out, patting my head, and said he was glad I was okay and had come to check on me once my husband left. Then he walked out of the room. I woke up from that dream in a foggy, lightheaded state and noticed a chair pulled up beside my bed. That chair hadn't been there before. The room was empty though, so I went back to sleep. The next morning I told the nurse about the vivid dream. She gave me a strange look and said, "That wasn't a dream. Your cousin David came to visit you last night." I froze. I don't have any cousins named David, but my ex-husband's name is David. After I explained everything, the nurse looked concerned and called the doctor. The doctor explained that the antibiotics might have caused delirium, which blurred the line between sleep and wakefulness. That could have explained why the experience felt so real. Later that day, I texted my ex-husband, demanding to know why he visited me and how he even knew I was in the hospital. My text delivered, but he ignored it. I sent another message telling him I heard his threats about my husband and that I was prepared to involve the police. Minutes later, he responded saying, "I never made any threats. I just wanted to check on you. Maybe you were dreaming or heard something in your sleep." I replied, "Stay out of my life, or I'll call the police." He didn't respond again after that. I never told my husband about the threats I thought I heard. With everything going on, antibiotics, delirium, and hallucinations, I wasn't sure if what I heard was real or not. I stayed in the hospital for about a week before being discharged. That week blurred the lines between reality and my worst fears, leaving me with questions I'll probably never be able to answer. I've worked as a nurse in several hospitals and facilities over the years. Before my current job, I worked at a geriatric hospital about 30 minutes from my house. I had experience with older patients, so I felt confident when I started. But I was only there for a couple of weeks before something happened that made me leave. It was during my second to last shift at that hospital. I was working the graveyard shift, exhausted and running on fumes. I'd barely slept the night before, but I pushed through as best I could. That night, I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward. The patients there seemed to like me, maybe because I was young, in my S, and brought a kind of energy they weren't used to. Many of them were quiet and detached, lost in their own thoughts, so I think my presence gave them a small anchor to the present. I was caring for several patients that night, but one in particular stood out. Her name was Lena. This was my first time working with her, and from the start she seemed unsettled. Every time I went into her room, she told me about voices she kept hearing, and a man dressed in black who stood silently in the corner. Her roommate had already asked for the curtain between their beds to be closed. She was a sweet older woman, always smiling at me but very forgetful and easily annoyed by Lena. By 11 p.m., most of the patients had fallen asleep, but not Lena. She called me into her room repeatedly, trembling and pale, insisting the man in black was still there. Her fear started to get to me. I didn't believe there was anyone in the room, but the intensity of her terror made it hard to ignore. Still, I tried to reassure her. I held her hands, told her to breathe, and reminded her that she wasn't alone. I was just a call away. Eventually, she seemed to calm down, and by the time I checked on her again, she was finally asleep. With the ward quiet, the night dragged on. Time seemed to crawl. Around a.m., I went to the linen room to restock my cart. The room was small, silent, and dimly lit. I had the door closed, so when I heard a faint noise behind me, it immediately caught my attention. I turned around, but the room was empty. Dismissing it as my imagination, I went back to stocking the cart. That's when I felt it. A hand. On my shoulder. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see someone there, but there was no one. I stumbled back, heart racing. I knew what I felt, a firm grip, as if someone was standing right behind me. Yet the room was empty. Shaking, I peeked into the hallway, but it was silent and still. Not a soul in sight. I tried to shake it off and finish stocking my cart, but as I turned to face the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A man. He was dressed in black, standing outside the door, staring at me through the glass. And he was smiling. My scream echoed through the ward as I stumbled and fell to the floor. My heart pounded as the man disappeared from view. Seconds later, the door burst open and one of my coworkers rushed in. She helped me to my feet, her face full of concern. "What happened?" she asked. "There was a man," I stammered. "A man in black, he was right there staring at me." Her brow furrowed. "There's no one here," she said. Together, we searched the entire ward, checking every room, but there was no trace of anyone matching the description. My screams had woken Lena. When I entered her room, she was wide awake and visibly shaken. "He's coming," she whispered. I hesitated before asking, "What did the man in black look like? Was he smiling?" Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment her expression shifted, focused and intense, more lucid than I'd seen her all night. "How did you know?" she asked. My heart skipped a beat. Before I could respond, Lena began screaming, "Get me out of here! He's coming!" Other nurses rushed in to calm her down. I was shaken to my core and asked to be reassigned to another ward for the rest of the night. Eventually, I left early because I couldn't handle being there anymore. The next day, I texted the head nurse to let her know I wouldn't be coming back after my next shift. I told her the experience had traumatized me and that I couldn't work in that building anymore. She was understanding, and I was grateful for her kindness. To this day, I have no explanation for what I experienced. I've never had hallucinations or anything like that. While I know exhaustion can play tricks on the mind, the hand on my shoulder and the man's smiling face felt far too real. What unsettles me most is how closely the man I saw matched Lena's description. Was it all in my head? Or was it something else? I don't know, but I hope I never experience anything like that again. A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just outside of town. I was thrilled. It was my first job after graduation, even though it was casual work. I was ecstatic. The money was good. And it was the same hospital where I did my training. Most shifts were hours, AM to PM, but sometimes I worked the late shift, too. I didn't enjoy those as much. Driving home late at night was exhausting. The hospital was small, just 4 nurses, 1 administrator, me, and the emergency doctor. Being in a small hospital, you see strange things. People who can't make it to the city come here. Sometimes emergencies require a helicopter to land. I've seen horrific accidents. Families lost on dangerous country roads. Once, someone even brought in an injured animal. No veterinarians nearby. They were desperate. One night, around 10 p.m., I was chatting with a nurse. We were going over a patient's chart, but mostly, we were just passing the time. My shift ended at 11. The hospital was quiet. Only 6 patients had checked in. Then I heard a strange noise near the entrance. A man walked toward us. He looked normal at first, but he wore a long coat. Strange considering it was midsummer. Even at night, it was still warm. The nurse sighed, stood up, and went to the restroom. leaving me to deal with the man. As he got closer, the noise grew louder. He was dragging something, the sound of metal scraping against the floor. It sent a shiver up my spine. When he reached the desk, I noticed his appearance. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, his face pale. It looked like he hadn't slept in days. I'd seen this look before. It screamed of someone under the influence. He ran his fingers through his hair, tugged at it, grinding his teeth. People like this often come seeking drugs. They'd complain of migraines or unprovable pain like fibromyalgia. I processed his information quickly. He grew increasingly irritable. I pointed him to the waiting area. He asked how long it would take. I estimated about half an hour. The doctor was on a short break. That's when his demeanor changed. His face twisted in anger. He stormed off to the waiting room. As he walked away, I noticed what he was dragging. My stomach dropped. It was an axe. Panic surged through me. I wanted to sound the alarm, but I didn't want to alert him. Quietly, I called the police on my cell phone. Then I signaled to the nurses. The police would take 20 minutes to arrive. The station was 2 towns over. The man started yelling in the waiting room, demanding help. My colleagues and I devised a plan. Lock him in. The waiting room doors were heavy. The glass was reinforced. It should hold until the police arrived. We locked the doors without him noticing. But when he realized, he started screaming, throwing chairs. Then, he began hacking at the door with the axe. We stood by the front desk, watching in terror. He was making progress. The door was starting to give. At that moment, the emergency doctor returned. He walked in through the main entrance, drink in hand. He noticed us huddled together. Taking charge, he assessed the situation. Then, he disappeared toward the back entrance. The one EMTs use. Suddenly, he tackled the man from behind. Catching him off guard, he restrained him with cable ties, sitting on his back until the police arrived. I was beyond grateful. That doctor likely saved our lives. I bought him coffee every time we worked together after that. But it never felt like enough. After this incident, I decided I'd had enough of late shifts. This was the second time something like this happened during a 3 to 11 shift. I switched to a 9 to 5 schedule, Monday through Friday. I've felt much safer ever since.